Hello everybody, this is Emrah Safa Gürkan, and today we're going to talk about World War II with whom? With Professor Antony Beevor, one of the best-selling authors of that period. He's a military historian, as he prefers. He's a historian of the war. Hello, Professor. Welcome to Istanbul. It's a great privilege to have you here. So you have studied quite a bit of the first half of the 20th century, the Russian Civil War, Spanish Civil War, and the World War II. And we see there, especially the Russian Revolution and World War II, are quite spectacular events, and they're kind of connected, one causing the other. So how do you see that connection? How do you, like, it's a peculiar century, right? It starts with a war, the war that we have never seen,
yes,
neither before nor in the future, to that greater scale. So how are they connected? Are they connected, and how's this connection?
I think they're connected in a very major way. German historians were absolutely right when they said the First World War was the original catastrophe of the 20th century. But what is important to understand, I think, about the Russian Civil War was the scale of it, the destruction, the horror, the cruelty had such an effect not just on Russia, but on the whole of Europe and beyond, in the way that it created this vicious circle of fear. And as a result, we see that not just the split between red and white, but we see communism, the rise of fascism as a result. We then see the Second World War, but before that even the Spanish Civil War. And really it created all of that pattern of the 20th century. And after the Second World War, we then see, of course, the First Cold War. And now, into the Second Cold War, what we see is a change of axis away from communism versus capitalism, but towards authoritarianism versus democracy. And the terrifying thing, in a way, I think, is that this geopolitical change has also brought in a new danger, and that is that even during the First Cold War, communist leaders, whether in Russia or in China, if they made a guarantee or they made an agreement or whatever, they stuck to them. You could trust it. Now that is no longer the case. And this is the frightening question, is what is the future of traditional diplomacy?
Does it remind you of 1939, like Ribbentrop Pact, like the Hitler reneging on his promises?
Well, I always try to fight. As a historian, I try to fight against historical parallels. I mean, because what we've seen, particularly in the Anglo-Saxon world, in the United States and Britain, is the way that the media and politicians always tried to make comparisons with the Second World War. And this is very dangerous because the Second World War was a war like no other. But just so as to sound like Churchill or Roosevelt or whatever and put themselves on a pedestal, political leaders always try to make themselves sound important, but also the crisis sound bigger than it really is by making the comparison to the Second World War. So I try to fight against it in a way. History echoes, or it has echoes, or it rhymes, but it never repeats itself.
Okay, it rhymes, but it never repeats itself. Yes. Okay, hope it doesn't rhyme that well.
It doesn't rhyme well. You're quite right.
It doesn't rhyme that well if we're talking about the Second World War. So, what is so peculiar about these wars? They're so dangerously, not only the wars, but the civil wars, the way this fear and aggression, this cycle. What are the reasons for that? Like what happened before 1910s that justified such fear, which in turn created an aggression to a scale that we have never seen? I'm not only talking about Hitler and Stalin, but also Mao and stuff like that. It was really easy to kill people at the time. Like, it was acceptable. When you look at the Stalin courts, for instance, everybody accepted that result. Or when you look at the Hitler society, Hitler-German society, everybody accepted those results. It was okay to kill people. Like today, it's unbelievably harsh. What created that environment?
Well, in the past, of course, in the wars of religion, the horror, the dehumanization and the cruelty was also just as bad when one thinks of, say, the 30 Years' War in Europe. Now, we thought that things would improve. After that came the Enlightenment. This leads on to quite an important question of why Russia is different in the way that it wages war, for example, to the West. And of course, there was no Enlightenment in Russia. It may have been, shall we say, rather concentrated on, say, Catherine the Great, but it didn't extend outwards at all. Some people say that it goes back to the Mongol invasions of the 13th century and Russia's fear of being encircled. But if you like, the quality of war, this belief that it has to be appalling simply so as to, as an article of war, as a weapon of war, is to terrify the other side through cruelty and through dehumanization. Now, all countries, all wars fighting in the past have to a certain degree dehumanized their enemy. But this is your point, which is absolutely right, is that really we see in the 20th century a new way of dehumanization. It wasn't just the invention of the radio or things like that, though that, of course, made it worse, this mass communications. But I mean, even at the beginning of the First World War, there was already atrocity propaganda, you know.
Belgium, for instance, right?
Claiming, for example, you know, that the German soldiers bayoneted babies and things like that, which I'm afraid was very much the fault of the British of creating a propaganda like that. Whether that actually really encouraged soldiers to kill more than they would have done otherwise, I don't know. But one thing that we have indeed learned is, especially during the Second World War, Goebbels had a diabolical genius in the way that he realized that hatred was not enough. You have to combine hatred with fear. And this is maybe something that he saw from the Russian Civil War, what I was talking about, this vicious circle of fear.
You believe that they saw it, they took it from the Russian Civil War?
I think so, yes. And one sees the way that, for example, the Nazis imitated the killing methods of the OGPU, of the GPU, the Cheka, during that particular period. You know, whether it was forcing the prisoners to undress, you dehumanized them in that particular way before you even killed them. And we see this even in the concentration camps. They threw the bread, for example, over the fence so that the prisoners would squabble and fight amongst each other. This is almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy to prove that they are like animals when you have actually turned them into animals by your dehumanizing process. So this whole question of propaganda and war, I think, is a terribly important one which we need to understand. And as one's saying in Ukraine, for example, one is seeing some of the appalling cruelties, the way that not just a question of mass rapes, as we saw with the Russian army in 1945 in Poland, in Central Europe, and above all, of course, in Germany, but also even in Ukraine, when seeing examples of castration of prisoners. I mean, this is something which one would not have imagined in Europe in the 20th century. So
it's like Spanish versus Aztecs in the 16th century, as if they encountered a society for the first time, like, yes. It's astonishing. But also they do it to their own people, like...
Yes. And you see, when I was researching, for example, when I was researching the book Stalingrad in Russia in the 1990s, I suddenly realized, of course, that there were nearly 5,000 suicides a year amongst the young Russian soldiers because of the bullying and the treatment when they reached the Russian barracks. And I suddenly realized, of course, that actually there's almost a historic thing in Russia. They're treating their own people as badly as they treat the enemy. And this was even seen as a joke by some of the Russian generals. The British ambassador was told by General Lebed, who thought it was very, very funny that in Siberia, they got the new recruits just who arrived to start digging graves, because the last time there weren't enough graves for the soldiers committing suicide, and they had to wait until the spring before the ground thawed.
Oh, so they could dig.
That they could dig, and he thought this was very funny. So I think one's got to understand where some of these mentalities come from and why they should be so different, particularly in a way between sort of, to what degree is this you can't generalize about any country when one talks about sort of, there is no DNA in any...
But the cultural ambience, like cultural environment, or like the toughness. Because when I read your works, especially the Fall of Berlin and the book about the Russian Civil War, I read so much about cruelties on part of the Russians and the Germans and all the war crime that they have committed. So what about the Western side? Did they have stuff like that, or were they bad? Because wherever there's a soldier, I mean, there will be some issues, there will be some crimes. It's not, you can't prevent it, but I got the impression, which I already had, but I'm asking you just to verify, that they were way much more cooler than their Western parts.
Well, there was certainly cruelty on the Western side. I mean, if one takes the First World War, the Kaiser wanted to starve all of the Russian soldiers to death of their prisoners. Well, I mean, this was, if you like, a foretaste of Hitler and the Second World War. So it was not just a question of Nazism at that particular point. Now, of course, there are always killings in war of prisoners. I mean, you know, we know very well that the British, when they sort of sent German prisoners back, often the sentries or the guards would kill the prisoners on the way, but often just for the reason reason that, they wanted to have some more free time, not necessarily out of...
There is no ideology behind that.
It wasn't necessarily an ideology. It's when you have the ideology that things become, you get the real mass killing. That is the difference between that and, shall we say, war crimes and total atrocities.
And also the war in the East is between the Germans and the Russians are way much more severe, and the conditions and the weather are really tough. They don't have the necessary equipment. One side is losing, first the Russians and then the Germans, so that should also have...
Well, it does indeed, but I mean there was dehumanization on both sides, and this is why after the Germans had committed their atrocities in the Soviet Union, in the occupied territories, when it then comes to revenge, you find that there's even in the propaganda and in the broadcast from, for example, writers like Ilya Ehrenberg, who talks about Germany as the blonde witch. I mean, that, by implication, is take your revenge on the German women.
You're a former officer, right?
Yes.
What would I do if I were an officer and if I receive an order that I don't like? It could be I don't like because it's illegal. This is one thing. Another thing, I don't like it, like Paulus in Stalingrad, because it's stupid.
Yes.
So Hitler, issues a lot of orders like that. So where does my responsibility start? You as a historian or an ex-officer, how much maneuvering can I make?
Yes.
Are we historians, are we being fair to them, especially when we're talking about stuff that are not illegal but stupid, like, not to get out of Stalingrad?
No, it's a very interesting question, because what we found very much is that when German officers had the moral courage to say, no, I refuse to do this or kill this, they did not suffer. They were not punished.
It's not like Stalin and his generals. Hitler has to, be cautious, right?
Well, no, but I mean, Russian generals were in a more difficult position, because if they disobeyed an order, they may have had the NKVD or whatever, particularly in the early days. I mean, and then suddenly Stalin started to realize that he had to give the generals much more support, and they became less frightened of the secret police. But I think it was very striking. It is a question of moral courage. Quite often, I've always found in history that those who have tremendous physical courage often are moral cowards. It's very rare for people to have both moral courage and physical courage. I'm sure you've probably come across that with your own research.
But whenever I read something, let's say you're on the battlefield, you receive an order from directly the Majesty, His Majesty the King. Where does it become disobedience and stop being initiative? It's really hard for a general, especially in a totalitarian society. I mean, in the case of Stalin, you can have your day in court in the Russian court is not a nice one, but to what extent could they disobey without being called a traitor?
Well, the German army had always believed, or certainly had developed, its philosophy of Auftragstaktik, of mission, mission identification, mission control, whereby officers were expected to show their initiative, ignore a bad order, and, if necessary, do what they needed. Now, Hitler wanted to crush this because, for him, it meant that he didn't have total control. And, for example, when he made Paulus a field marshal at Stalingrad, he expected Paulus to commit suicide because that was quite inevitable or obvious from the order that he'd given to hold on to Stalingrad. Paulus refused to commit suicide, and Hitler was furious. He regarded that as treason. So this is a question. Hitler actually, in a way, destroyed the German army because he destroyed its essential policy or its essential ethic of Auftragstaktik by simply saying, you will not question any of my orders under any circumstances.
There's also some sort of a class issue there, because I believe Paulus says, I'm not going to kill myself for a Bohemian corporal or something like that.
That was Rundstedt who talked about the Bohemian corporal. Yes. Paulus said something fairly similar, you're right. But it was the actual phrase of the Bohemian corporal was Rundstedt. But Rundstedt, as you say, being much more of an aristocrat, was certainly going to ignore what he regarded as the brown band, well, i.e. the Nazis. But what is very interesting about getting intelligence wrong, the British and the Americans completely misunderstood the consequences of the bomb plot against Hitler in July 1944. They imagined that any army ready to blow up their own commander-in-chief, Hitler, must be in a state of disintegration. What they failed to see was that by the failure to blow up Hitler, this handed total power to the Nazis and to the SS, and therefore the German army was not going to be able to surrender or do anything on its own authority or on its own initiative, simply because now the Nazis had complete control, and therefore the war would go on until the day that Hitler died. And the British and the Americans misunderstood that completely.
Would you say that the Wehrmacht, the German army, somehow, or the elites or the generals, came to an understanding early on in return for the continuation of their privileges, and they just, like, what do you think about this clean Wehrmacht idea that became so popular in the 1950s? Okay, they weren't all Nazis, and everybody did this weird stuff at the time, okay, but
well, some were Nazis, some weren't definitely Nazis.
But they weren't all.
But others felt that, you know, they should somehow uphold the honor of the Wehrmacht. But at the same time, let's face it, they were supporting the SS in terms of the atrocities against Jews. And they were, in fact, when it came to, say, wwII and the massacre of 30,000 Jews there outside Kiev, that was very much something where they were completely involved. And this myth, which was created in West Germany after the war, that it was only the SS who were war criminals, the Wehrmacht were never war criminals, of course was a complete myth.
Later created to exonerate, because society needs to move on, right? The Germans probably in the 1950s, 60s somehow have to come to some sort of a resolution, some sort of a...
Well, yes, and also for, shall we say, to help NATO and the myth of NATO and all the rest of it.
And some of these ex-German generals and the scientists were used by
the commanders in the German army. So,
yeah. And also some are used by the Americans and the NATO for some purposes. So
absolutely.
You also seem critical. I never thought it like that. Like these German high command always ordering, you should, you know, hold your ground, you should die here, and then they sneak out themselves. Or like, while all these soldiers are hungry, I mean, when they were caught, yes, like they seem quite, not like with a caviar in their mouth, but they seem quite well fed. So you seem critical of that, but isn't it natural, or am I being too positivistic here? Like, if you're a general, obviously you're not gonna suffer, and the soldiers are to be dispensed with a little bit easier. Isn't it like in every war, or is it something?
Oh, I think that is like in every war, but what is astonishing is the ways that, say, for example, after Stalingrad, when they captured so many generals, as well as all these soldiers, that of the soldiers who were sent off for slave labor, only 5% survived. Of the generals who were captured, only 5% died. So, I mean, this is very striking, because you would have thought that the Soviet system would have wanted to take revenge on the generals more than on the ordinary soldiers. But in fact, it didn't turn out that way at all. So a complete paradox.
So Renoir's movie was right. You know, in the First World War, these generals are just, you know, going to duck hunting together.
Yes. It's not the duty of generals to fight against each other, you know.
Even though, I mean, but you wouldn't expect from a Bolshevik state, you know, being against aristocracy and, you know, privilege.
Yes.
But the cultural stuff remains stuck.
Well, for some reason, it certainly seemed to. You would have thought that they would have given the generals a more unpleasant time, or at least as equally unpleasant a time as the ordinary soldiers. But they didn't. They were living in virtually privileged conditions.
In your book, Stalingrad, you were mentioning Paulus basically refused to do what he was told to, and they reminded him politely that he has to do what he was told. Not even that, I think they were the ones who were calling the shots. I mean, it was so unlike the other treatments, like a Soviet general talking to a German general was quite apologetic, quite civilized. I was really shocked reading that.
Yes,
also.
I know. It was, as you say, a complete paradox in terms of communist beliefs.
There's also a racial element playing a big hand in that difference, in the difference of number of people dying in prisoners camp, right? In the West, between the French or German, with the Germans and the Americans, they're like 3% or 5% or something like that. On the other hand, if a Russian falls into the hands of the Germans or vice versa, in one case 35, in the other 57% or something like that. Huge numbers.
Huge numbers, you're quite right. But again, this is like a reflection of what I was saying about the First World War, when the Kaiser did not believe that Russian prisoners should be fed. Well, we had exactly the same thing with the Germans, that the Russian soldiers who were captured by the Wehrmacht were fed virtually nothing. I mean, starvation rations. But of course, British, Americans, French were treated according to the Geneva Convention. Now, one of the problems, of course, was that Stalin
didn't sign it, right?
Stalin refused to sign the Geneva Convention, which gave the Germans this excuse to behave in the way that they did towards their prisoners.
One thing that actually struck me in your book, you describe life of the ordinary soldier and the bad things he did, the good things he did, the sufferings, and also the strategies of the civilians developed in order to combat with that. Yeah. So I think that is really interesting. Well, most people when we say military history, they think of battles and tanks. They're there.
I am not a military historian.
You're not John Keegan, although he's still...
No, but I'm not a military historian. As the great Professor Sir Michael Howard said, we are not military historians, we are historians of war.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's terribly important because that means one should cover the effect on civilians, on the ordinary soldiers, as well as in battle. It's not a question of which division or regiment moved in which direction. And this is terribly important, I think, because particularly for a younger generation today, how do you explain why and how people had no control over their own lives? And this is why one needs to have history from below combined with history from above, so that you understand the consequences of the decisions by, say, Stalin or Hitler on the mass of the population, and why people literally did what they had to do, which meant sometimes betrayal, sometimes great moral courage, sometimes tremendous physical courage even, but somehow they had to survive. And this is what one has to understand today, particularly, shall we say, in the West, where we have a post-military society, a society where health and safety are vital concerns. But what a historian should do, and the duty of the historian, in my view, is to understand and to convey that understanding to the readers. And it is up to the readers to come to moral judgments. I do not believe that a historian should start to make moral judgments too much in their books, because otherwise that is the politicization of history.
Then you just, establish the facts and, leave the reader to do that judgment. But again, it's really interesting because when you look at all this war and today's society, it's changed too much. Today, war is relegated to computer games, and all these computer games that are sold like in huge amounts are generally shooting at each other.
Or history is relegated to TV and movies.
And they always, are interesting. They seem to think we Easterns are generally, disappointed when somebody else assumes that our job is to, talk about divisions or talk about which king comes after the other. But it's not that. I think your books are really interesting in that concept, that showing us how military history also deals with people and shows us the brutalness of war.
Well, it changed. I think that it changed. I mean, history itself has changed in the sense it always used to be top down, and it was, if you like, a collective view. Now, what's very interesting, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, this was the Great Revolution. We didn't realize what a revolution was taking place. The effects only started to be seen with 2008 and the economic crisis then, and now the sort of, if you like, in a way, the crisis of democracy we're seeing in the West, or the lack of confidence. I mean, what happened at that particular time was that we had the invention of the internet. I'm talking about 1990, around then. The invention of the internet, the collapse of the Soviet Union, globalization, open economic borders, and all the rest of it. All of that actually created a different sort of society. And I think that what we are seeing today is this fear of social change and economic change and all the rest of it, and the lack of confidence in the future. And it comes along also with this change in attitudes to history. And the emphasis on the individual, I think, now is very important. And people want to know what people went through, what they experienced at the time, rather than the old-fashioned version of history.
But also there are really great details. As a military historian myself, I'm although off the 16th century, not of the 20th, but they were like, the military camp is an interesting phenomenon, right? They're like, prostitutes, or they're like, or some take lovers, they're playing cards while they're about to die, and they're gossiping, they're writing letters, like 1 million letters going up and coming down. Like, it's so interesting, especially you see that in the First War as well, that these guys go on living under these very harsh conditions, and you see what happens when human psychology is pushed to its limits.
Yes.
Both in terms of atrocity, but also in terms of the will to go on living, even if your days are numbered, most probably. Or even stuff like, the German women developing different strategies not to get raped, like taking a lover among one of these Russian soldiers so that he could protect her from the others. I mean, today, nobody is left with choices like that, like at least.
Well, we don't know. It might happen again. We cannot rule it out.
Or maybe it does happen in, other parts of Yemen or
in other areas of conflict. But I think what is very striking is how one can misread or misunderstand what is happening. And this is the mistake of the British and the French in the 1930s, was to think that the First World War was so horrific that nobody who was in their right mind could ever want to have another war in Europe. They completely misunderstood that Hitler was determined to have another war in Europe. And that was why the Second World War took on the sort of totally genocidal form that it did. We made the same mistake again with Vladimir Putin, assuming that because the Second World War was so horrific, nobody would want to have another conventional war, state-on-state conflict in Europe. That's why people couldn't believe that there was going to be an invasion of Ukraine. So this is, I think, one of the troubles. It's a question of confirmation bias, or democratic confirmation bias, which makes democracies incapable of understanding the mentality of dictators.
Oh, actually, during my first year at PhD at Georgetown University, one day I said, look, Europe can go into war or something like that.
Yes.
I was like, just talking small talk. Everybody went berserk on me like that. No, it's not going to happen. I was like, what the hell did I say? As if I said something very shocking. Yes. I think it became some sort of a taboo in the Western society to talk about another, genocidal war like that. And yes. It is very much possible.
This I'm afraid is the optimism, the naive optimism, if you like, of the Western liberal, is always to believe that progress is inevitable and it will go on.
Go back to 1913 then.
And the idea that things could actually go back, they don't want to face that idea.
So again, when you look at this World War II, there are a couple of stuff, when you look at Stalingrad, was it strategically that important that I never grasped this? What if the Germans actually took Stalingrad? Would it be enough? Because when you look at the numbers and they're so outnumbered in every context, was it like, it's because documentary guys made it so, right? They always talk about...
No, but the Germans had promised their soldiers, if we win the Battle of Stalingrad, that means that the war itself is won, which was actually a myth, because the Germans had this idea that if they managed to advance all the way to what was called the AA line, which is the Archangel-Astrakhan line, and then they could hold off the Russians with the Luftwaffe. Well, this was totally untrue. The point about Stalingrad was that it was the psychological turning point of the war. The geopolitical turning point of the Second World War came in December 1941. From that point, with the Wehrmacht blocked in front of Moscow, the failure to capture Moscow, and the communications system, and above all, of course, the American entry into the war. I mean, it's astonishing the number of Americans and Germans who still believe that America declared war on Germany. It wasn't.
No, it was Hitler.
Germany. It was Hitler who declared war on the United States. But I mean, from that moment, there was no question that Germany could ever win. From Stalingrad, the defeat at Stalingrad, it was obvious that the war was going to be over and it was going to end in Berlin. I mean, I remember when researching Stalingrad in the Russian archives, one came across this occasion when a Russian colonel shouts in the face of the German prisoners, pointing to the ruins around, saying, this is what Berlin is going to look like. It was this idea that Nazi Germany was definitely finished. It was going to take a year or 2 years or maybe even 3 years, but there was no doubt about it.
As long as there is no separate peace. Right?
So it was the total psychological turning point of the war.
If, given that. So did Hitler find himself in a game in which the more he succeeds, the more he's closer to defeat, as given that nobody is willing to sign a separate peace? Because at the beginning of the war, if Britain signed a peace, it would be all over then.
You're quite right. Yeah. In May 1940, that was the first turning point of the war, because it was the only moment when Hitler could have won the whole war. Because Churchill realized that even though it looks as if we were about to lose the whole of the British army at Dunkirk, Churchill realized that even if we asked, as the Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, wanted to do, even if we asked the Italians to find out from Hitler what his terms would be, that would actually be the collapse of Britain, and therefore that would actually be the end of the war. Because then Hitler would be able to concentrate all of his forces against the Soviet Union.
So Hitler has to be quick, because in terms of fuel, in terms of industry, he's fighting and money. The only advantage he has is that he's mobilized and willing to fight.
Yes.
So he has to finish it in a couple of years.
Yes.
But we're not going to sign the peace separately. Deal means that Hitler cannot win.
So if Britain had not fought on in 1940, Hitler would have won.
Or in December 1941, if Russia was crushed.
Yes.
He might have won, but short of that...
But even so, I still don't think that he would have crushed, because when Stalin summoned the Bulgarian ambassador Staminov, to see, because at that stage Stalin thought they were being defeated, and to find out what the peace terms might be. Staminov actually then said to Stalin, but you're crazy, because you can retreat all the way to the Urals and you'll still win in the end. And this is where he was right and Stalin was completely wrong, because Stalin had failed to take in the lesson of the Sino-Japanese War. If a country with a huge landmass, like China or like Russia, can keep on retreating,
scourge,
and your opponent may have the better army, it may have the more professional army and better weapons, it will simply be ground down by the sheer volume of space. And this is what happened, of course, the more that Stalin retreated further all the way to the Volga in the case of Stalingrad and kept fighting, the more that the Germans actually were going to destroy their own army. And this is definitely what happened. But Hitler, even though there were German officers advising Chiang Kai-shek in China, Hitler never saw the parallel with the Sino-Japanese War.
Did he have a choice? If he didn't attack in 1941, would Stalin retaliate with all these T-34s being much produced in
Well, here I'm afraid we're very much into counterfactual history, which certain of my colleagues, like Andrew Roberts and Neil Ferguson, love playing counterfactual games. I think it's very important to pose the question and wonder about it, but I don't think you can start sort of saying this will happen, that will happen, or whatever. I don't believe in that. But if one does talk about sort of, 1941 and December and so forth, or even talk about sort of, 1940, it's very, very hard to say how anything would have turned out. I mean, some people like playing that game. I don't.
Then let me be more concrete so it doesn't become counterfactual. In 1941, did you encounter any evidence for, showing that Stalin had in mind all these preparations in the 1941 could have resulted, or was there a plan? Because I think there was a plan. Zhukov prepared for first attack on the Germans.
No, Zhukov, this was the May the 11th, Zhukov did this war plan. I mean, it was contingency planning, which every chief of staff should do, because Zhukov knew that by then that the Germans were definitely going to attack. Stalin was still in denial. He refused to believe that this was going to happen.
And I think he shelved that plan, right? He didn't...
Absolutely. But because the thing was, they knew that actually the Red Army was not in a position to beat the Wehrmacht at that particular point. Why Stalin was so angry with the French was because they had surrendered, and it was because all of the French army vehicles were used in the invasion of Russia.
He was expecting France to hold out, right?
And this is why he was sort of basically so dismissive with de Gaulle that the whole of the French Communist Party were ignored during most of the occupation, because Stalin was so angry with the French over this particular element. Because they were not, the Red Army was simply not prepared. And for example, all of the tractors for towing artillery were all being used in the harvest because they simply didn't have enough. Stalin thought that maybe in 2 or 3 years' time that the Red Army would be in a position to attack. But we're talking now well into the future, but by then the Wehrmacht might have been even stronger. We don't know, so we can't say. But there's no doubt about it, though, that the Red Army was not in a position to invade and conquer the Wehrmacht in 1941.
Also, we have to remember that these Bolsheviks were treated very poorly by the West for like 20 years. So Stalin coming into terms with Britain and entering into an alliance of France and Britain, there's also a psychological effect, right? They were totally shunned by them, excluded by them, especially in the early stages in the Russian Civil War, So there's also this hatred between, which later resulted in the Cold War anyways.
Well, we're talking about the period really leading up to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, or the of August 1939. The trouble there, of course, was that Poland knew how much Stalin hated the Poles. I mean, he hated the Poles even more than he hated the French. And this was because, of course, the defeat and the way that he was blamed for the defeat in 1921 in the Battle of the Vistula and his refusal to help Tukhachevsky at that particular point. And, of course, the Poles were not going to allow Stalin, and this is why in 1938, and there was no question really of Stalin intervening on behalf of Czechoslovakia. And the Poles were not going to allow the Red Army to come across their territory, because they knew perfectly well that once again the Soviets would try and take over Poland.
Which they will do eventually
in a
matter of years. There is a quotation that I took from your book: outsiders with no experience of the fighting could not understand the problems, which we see a lot in military history, right? Like, because Hitler is intervening and Stalin is intervening.
Yes.
So what is the procedure? Throughout history, we see stuff like that. People are deciding on their desk what to do on the battlefield. My first question is, was Hitler always so illogical with this? He doesn't understand anything at all? Is this the case? Or, how would you evaluate his...
Well, Hitler was a micromanager. I mean, he insisted on sometimes even having the 1 to 20,000 maps. And he was even talking about company positions, not about armies or army groups or anything like that.
That always backfired, right? That kind of micromanagement from afar.
Yes, because communications were so slow. When one comes to, for example, 1945 and the Soviet attack from the line of the river Vistula all the way towards the river Oder, there was Stalin basically giving his generals their heads and they could just rush through. But I mean, Hitler was trying to tell his generals, not to do this, not to do that, etc., not to pull back, when he was 24 hours out of date because of the time it took signals going back and forwards to Führer headquarters. And so as a result, the Germans were completely almost manacled in their positions without being able to react to real events.
And he loses contact with reality towards the end.
Yes, but Stalin, on the other hand, was a very bad war leader in 1941 and during most of 1942, and it was finally in October 1942, during the battle for Stalingrad, or in the preparation for that for Stalingrad, that Stalin then gave confidence enough to the generals to do the job themselves. And that's when Stalin became a great war leader from that point of view.
Before that, Stalin had created a huge problem, killing people like Tukhachevsky, killing 90% of the Russian high command.
Yes.
As well as the Bolshevik, Central Committee of 1970. Like, the Russia had been through so much, but they lost all war readiness because of him.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the purge of the Red Army, starting in 1936, going on 1937 and so forth, was utterly disastrous because it meant that it wasn't just a question they lost some of their best commanders. It also meant that all the other commanders left behind were terrified and therefore wouldn't move. And this is what went wrong. In 1945, when the Germans attacked, they didn't dare react. They didn't dare either attack or counterattack or do anything like that. And they were just sat there frozen. And this was the destruction of the Red Army in the summer of 1941.
Okay, because once you lose initiative, in that kind of society, why would I risk my head?
But it's quite interesting that you see at the start of the war, Hitler was really quite a good war leader because, in fact, at that stage he was giving them things. And he then became a disastrous war leader, while Stalin, who started off as a very bad war leader, then became a much better war leader by the end.
In the Battle of France, it was Hitler who actually forced the high command to approve Manstein's plan, right?
Yes.
Interventions in the early stages were right. Do you buy into this? Hitler was losing control because of the drugs he was using? Because some of these documentary guys created all these myths. One is the Stalingrad was the culmination of everything. The other is maybe, I'm not sure, you're the expert, that Hitler is depicted towards the end as if he's somebody who's into drugs and like...
Well, the drugs did play a part. I mean, a German historian friend of mine, who I saw again a few days ago, Norman Ohler, wrote this whole book about Hitler's drug taking and the effect of the Morels injections.
I read that book. Yeah, that was I was... Is it
Yes,
legit?
Norman Ohler, yes, definitely played a part.
Could it be a general depression? Because I was appalled when I was reading your books or other books that a lot of people went into total depression. Even the best generals couldn't handle that amount of pressure. I can't think of the toll it took. Such lonely figures leading an entire nation and, coming up with all this bullshit that, they made people believe in them and then everything is crashing.
But it's quite interesting, on the Allied side, there was a different problem. And that was the problem of ego. Because here you had generals who at the beginning of the war, nobody had ever heard of them. Suddenly they became film stars because all of the cameramen, the journalists were all there at their headquarters. And they started to get carried away with their own ego. So you have somebody like General Montgomery, on the British general. You have General Mark Clark.
Last night I watched Patton, the movie.
Or Patton, or MacArthur in the Far East. And they all became obsessed with their own public relations.
They did their PR, right?
Not all of them, but I mean, these were the worst examples. But it was quite interesting the way that you could see their notion. Now, leadership was charisma. That was sort of the new version of leadership. And in the case of General Mark Clark, he had 50 members in his staff of public relations to make sure that the journalist only took his right side of the face because he was very proud of his Roman profile. And his staff officers started to refer to him as Marcus Aurelius Clarkus as a joke because he was so obsessed about capturing Rome.
I read somewhere that, the Patton speech to the Third Army, whatever, like this. His speech is one of two greatest motivational speeches of all time. The other was Shakespeare's Battle of Agincourt in Henry V.
Henry V. No, it wasn't actually Agincourt, it was Harfleur, where he makes, yes. And I'm
But no, one is Shakespeare, the other is Patton. Patton's speech is nowhere near Shakespeare's.
Well, Patton's speeches were quite funny in a particular way because they were often so obscene and all the rest of it. But I'm afraid every movie now, every war movie, they seem to have some sort of Henry V speech, Shakespeare speech or whatever, you know, to rouse up their troops. And you see this in almost every single movie now.
But it was quite out of the ordinary at the time, right? Especially in the West.
Well, how many soldiers in the end heard these speeches, we don't know. But,
that's also another question. One last question.
Yes.
Why did Hitler now leave Berlin? If he left Berlin, like, what would have happened? Like,
what if he'd flown down to Berchtesgaden?
What were his options?
Well, he would have been captured at some particular
Göring,
point,
right?
I think. Göring was already down in Berchtesgaden, and he was ready to, if necessary, to surrender or even sort of take over as Führer. Hitler was furious about that. The reason why he stayed in Berlin was he knew he was going to die there. And he was interested in his legacy, the myth of National Socialism.
So he believed in his bullshit. That's what I'm trying to get at. He believed in this story.
Yes, and he wanted to have a lesson for the future. It's quite interesting that Albert Speer, when he was interrogated by the Americans at the end of the war, he complained about the fact that, you know, people always emphasize the collapse of a dictatorship or whatever, rather than its origins, or its heroic origins, i.e. he was thinking of, you know, the construction of the autobahns and all the rest of it. In Hitler's case, he was actually terrified of being captured and being taken to Moscow in a cage and humiliated as a prisoner.
Vercingetorix, right? That Julius Caesar brought the leader of the Gauls in a cage.
Well, this was in Hitler's mind. So he wanted to have a heroic death. It would be broadcast that Hitler died at the head of his troops, as if somehow Hitler was capable of even walking into battle when he was in such a state of tremors. He wouldn't have been able, it was surprising even, he was able to hold the gun to his head because he took the poison and then shot himself as well.
Which makes sense, because seeing Hitler in that kind of state would have created a huge disappointment, as if losing the war and you know all these millions of deaths weren't enough. But it's like the image is so.
Oh yes, it would have been a grotesque image, and this is what Speer was so angry about, that sort of Nazism would only be remembered by the finish, the grotesque finish of the end in Berlin, rather than its other earlier, more what he regarded as more heroic moments.
Falling prisoner to Russians is something that all the generals are afraid of, right? They're rushing to the western side, so that they don't want to fall in the hands of the Stalin.
Well, they weren't going to survive. I mean, they weren't going to live too badly if they'd been captured. But quite rightly, most of the soldiers were trying to get to the west because they didn't want to end up as what we call as Stalin horses, they're referred to, which would have meant basically cutting timber in the forest and basically acting as sort of human beasts of burden, slave labor. So yes, that was why they all wanted to get over the River Elbe and get into the western zones.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor.
I really enjoyed talking to you. I got all these questions. I had already read your book.
You probably ignored most of your questions.
No, I wasn't even able to ask one of them. There are like 25 questions there. It was quite a talk. Your books are extremely easy to read, and I learned a lot from them. But some of them are banned in Ukraine and Russia, right?
Well,
is it true?
No. I'll explain about the Ukraine one. I mean, with the Russian one, if I go back to Russia, I'm liable to 5 years imprisonment because of the Berlin book, because of all of the material on the mass rapes, which actually came from the Russian archives.
That's their document.
But the question of Ukraine, it was a silly
It's
thing.
a little bit stupid, right? Because
Well, it was. What happened was, I think the head of Ukraine media, and this was obviously before the war, found that the Russian edition of my book, which was sold in Ukraine in the Russian-speaking areas, that the Russian translator had, when I had talked about the Ukrainian militia who were supporting the SS, when it was a question of rounding up Jews, that translated that as Ukrainian nationalists. And not my fault, I couldn't control the translation. But then you found the Russian, this was what was incredible hypocrisy. The Russian embassy in London, where as far as they were concerned, I was the Kremlin's most hated person because I was the chief slanderer of the Red Army, they suddenly started supporting me against Ukraine. Anyway, so you can imagine.
Anyways, it's been quite a conversation. It's been quite my mind is about to blow. We've talked about a lot of of stuff. I really enjoyed it. It was quite a program. I learned a lot. I hope you learned a lot as well, or new questions popped up in your mind. It did in mine. Today, we talked about World War II with Professor Antony Beevor. Until next time, see you around. Take care.